Good morning. I'd like to welcome everyone here to our talk. Our talk today will be the Protect Your Land, Protect Your Legacy. It'll be about giving you some options about land trusts, protection of our lands, either in perpetuity or to be able to provide some more potential space for the future. And the idea of we as the Agricultural Commission find it necessary that our most important is that land is to be protected, potentially for agriculture on a lot of different levels. But the town supports this, and this is something that's been brought up by the local populace through by our master plans. So it definitely is something that we've been charged that we have been provided. So I'm going to pass the microphone over to Tom O'Shea, who's going to introduce our speakers for today. So thank you all. There's some coffee and some donuts. Enjoy the speak, and we'll talk to you soon.
Great, thank you, Steve. And I'm Tom O'Shea. I'm also on the Agricultural Commission and have also been in the conservation business in Massachusetts for long time now. It's starting to feel like. It's certainly been my pleasure to have worked with previously and also still work with today, actually, Mr. Rob Warren, who is now the managing director of land conservation for the Trustees of Reservation, which is a statewide land trust, in fact, the oldest land trust in the country. And so Rob has certainly been in the business of conservation, land protection for quite a while himself. And in particular, Rob and I have gone back all the way to your time at Department of Fish and Game when we were the state was actively protecting open space to the order of 40,000 acres at that time. And then I know that Rob has also worked with the Nature Conservancy, the state chapter in Massachusetts, also involved in land protection. And of course, that's a national-wide organization, so even broader scope. And then now with the Trustees, which is a Massachusetts organization. So we really are, I think, quite fortunate to have Rob, who's been a real leader in Massachusetts in land protection here and in the land trust community, speaking today. We also are really fortunate to have Attorney George Dresser, who is on the White Oak Land Trust board and might have even, I think, founding member of the land trust here in Holden. So George has certainly done a lot in the community for land protection and beyond, and so we're really fortunate to have somebody who knows how land trusts here at the local level work and has been a part of that. And I think for anyone not here today but is viewing this in the future through the YouTube or otherwise, I'm glad you've tuned in. I think this is going to be a great talk and great set of information for people who are interested in protecting open space. In particular, I think in Holden, that's important to us, and also in this region because there is still a fair amount of open space that I think makes for the quality of life for all of us here in our communities. I will ask everybody who's attending, could you raise your hand if you're a landowner that has land to protect? Okay. And how many of you are on a land trust or a member of a land trust? Okay. So just trying to get a sense of where everybody's at. And with that, I guess it's my pleasure to introduce Rob Warren. So Rob, do you want to come up and begin?
Thank you, Tom. Good morning. Well, first, thanks for having me here to talk about this. I've been talking about it and doing some of this work for a very long time, and I'm very happy to have this opportunity. The one other credential I'll offer is my family history in Holden. My great-grandfather moved here long ago, and my dad was born and raised here. And I've been visiting since, come to see my grandmother since I can remember, so it's nice to be back in Holden. It's interesting to see a mix of landowners and land trust folks, and some hands went up twice, which is great. I've got a fair amount of material that is on a lot of the kind of nuts and bolts on how land conservation actually gets carried out on the ground. And so I think it's equally applicable. If we're talking about a topic and I'm coming at it from one side and you're really interested in it from the other side as a landowner or land trust, please just raise your hand, ask a question as we go for clarifying things. And for bigger questions, we'll definitely have some time at the end for folks to zero in on the things that are most intriguing or confusing to you. So a general overview of what I'm going to address, a little bit on land protection planning, long before you actually start working on either as a land trust, start working with a landowner, or as a landowner working with a land trust. You really want to be thinking ahead to some of your goals. You don't have to have all the answers in either role, but it's really important to give a little thought before you leap too deeply in the conversation. And then it's great to get the conversation going before you have a firm idea, because whoever you're talking to is going to have some good ideas, some different ideas. It's a great opportunity to figure things out as you talk. So we'll talk about planning, a little bit about what motivates landowners, and I'll be interested to see if that resonates with the folks in this room who are considering conservation of their lands. The toolbox, how do we actually do conservation so that it lasts over time? How we structure deals, a little bit, and tax benefits, which is crucial to making many deals work. It's a way that we can bring funding into a project that the land trust doesn't have to raise, and the landowner doesn't have to give up altogether. So there's some great opportunities in how our tax structures are built. So land protection planning. If you're a land trust or a landowner, you want to think about your long-term goals. Why am I doing this? Why am I thinking about this? What is it that I really want in the kind of big picture frame? Particularly for a land trust, for sale signs pop up in your area, in your work area all the time. You want to be thinking about what it is you want to achieve through land conservation long before you're chasing for sale signs across the landscape, because the game is half over when the for sale sign goes up. And ideally, you want to be having conversations well before that. Advanced planning. So once you know what you're trying to do, you got to make a plan. You got to think about what properties in your work area will help you achieve your strategic goals, and which ones you might need to forego from a conservation perspective, or even which ones might be more important to your town to serve a different public purpose, public benefit, which includes tax revenue, frankly. Feasibility. What can you accomplish as a land trust? How much funding can you bring to a project? And this is one where it's easy to get scared off early, but you really want to ask yourself these questions, do a lot of investigation before you decide this one's just too expensive for us. Because there are good funding sources out there. There are individuals who care about it. There are organizations who have grant programs. There are foundations. So feasibility is about funding. It's also about your organization's capacity to manage the project, to manage multiple projects maybe, and then to manage the land after the exciting acquisition part's over. And then last, opportunity cost. If you've built a war chest of funding, property comes into play and you jump on that one, and then the next month, the property you really want comes into play, well, you've just spent your war chest. So again, chasing for sale signs across the landscape can leave you in a position to not really achieve your overall strategic goals. So why do we protect land? This is a piece of the list of the reasons that land trusts pursue land conservation and the reasons that landowners want to pursue their own. Habitat, wildlife habitat, what gets talked about all kinds of ways. We talk about it as just protecting the woodlands, protecting the rivers. All of that really is bound up in the idea of habitat conservation. Character of community and scenic benefits, again, of a totally valid reason to pursue land conservation. That vista that you love from the road on your way home, you're probably not the only one who loves that, and there are folks who will help protect that over time. Agriculture, well, we're here with the Ag Commission today, so that's clearly a key one, and agriculture has a lot of components to it. It's about the character of community is bound up in agriculture. The state agricultural conservation programs focus very much on building many farms in an area so that it can support an equipment store, so it can support an equipment repair shop, so there are enough farmers to support the feed shop. So there are a lot of things that go into even just thinking about agriculture, not to mention where the good soils are. There are often farms where there aren't good soils, and there are actually great ag soils that don't already have farms on them. So the data piece really is important to this too. Recreation is a part of most projects. Farms, it can be a little dicey to blend recreation with agriculture, but there are often ways to do that when that's a value. Water supply, cultural and historic values, even carbon sequestration is driving land conservation these days. So again, from either the land trust side or the landowner side, there are a whole host of reasons. You don't need to pick one, but it's important to understand which of the group you do care about, which of this list will drive your work forward. When it comes to the actual specific parcels, we've talked about the planning ahead, identifying what you want to conserve over time. You want to start the conversation, you want to start that relationship before that property hits the marketplace. Again, when the for sale sign goes up, the game is well on. And if you can be building that relationship, so when a landowner is interested in doing something with their land, they're reaching out to a conservation group before they're reaching out to a broker, that's a fantastic opportunity for both sides. A seller can avoid brokerage fees, and the land trust can really have the opportunity to have a conversation outside the pressures of an active marketplace. Also start learning about your funding resources. I know the Ag Commission is working on building a bit of a war chest, which is great and critical. You want to add to that knowledge about where to go to grant funding sources from government agencies, from private foundations. Who in your community who has significant resources financially might care about this too. Get to know them, bring them into your planning. Reviewing open space plans. And so this is part of the looking ahead, figuring out what parcels, what ownerships you want to be thinking about as a land trust so that you're getting ahead of that curve. Reviewing your town's open space plan. Some towns keep those up to date, sometimes they're kind of old. Either way, there's going to be some interesting information in there about what was set as a priority for what reasons at that point in time. Looking at there's all great resources online. The state Mass GIS program has this Oliver system, it's called, online, where you can just, if you've got the internet, you've got some great mapping resources that will zoom in right to your town. We were talking before with a couple of folks here, Steve and others, about looking at Chapter 61, 61A, and 61B enrollments. These are programs that the state has enacted in law that lets a landowner reduce their property tax for years and years, potentially, simply by saying, I'm going to keep my land in the use it's in now for a while. It's not permanent. You can reverse it. You can get out of that program, but basically you're making a lot of commitments on how you'll manage your land, and then the town actually has the right to, if you decide to sell your land, you can go out, make a deal with someone, but then the town has the opportunity to say, okay, we're gonna take on that deal. We're gonna pay you the same price that that private party would have, but we're gonna take that on as conservation land for the town. And land trusts help towns do that all the time. So looking at what lands are in those programs is really a critical piece of understanding how conservation could play out in the future in your town. We talked a little about soils. So turning to landowner motivation. There are all sorts of reasons that landowners get involved in this, and there are all sorts of types of landowners. We think about family lands a lot, and that's sort of what most of the nice stories are about. But folks doing land conservation work, we're working with everybody who could possibly own land. We're working with individuals who own land, individual farmers. We're also dealing with occasionally some sort of small corporate farm operators. We deal with family trusts, we deal with financial institutions who acquire assets through either foreclosure or through estates. Public agencies here, meaning not conservation agencies, but housing authorities that may be surplusing land. There are all kinds of ways that land goes through a public agency and back potentially into private hands. Developers, of course, who may be have acquired more than they're able to take on in terms of developing at that point. They need to liquidate some of it. There's an opportunity. Organizational properties, institutional lands, huge area for conservation work. So again, it's great to get to know individuals in your town and your work area. really thinking broadly about who owns the lands that serve our strategic goals, and who should we be getting to know. Looking, again, at whatever type of owner, there are a whole range of reasons they may be motivated. Some, it is just a business deal, and a lot of conservation gets done this way. At market value for that land, the landowner, the seller, the bank, whatever it might be, has really no interest other than maximizing their revenue for that asset. That can actually be a fairly easy deal to do if you can fund it, because they're not sort of caught up emotionally in the transaction, but you've got to bring some real money to the table. Some landowners are focused on an organization that they feel connected to, and they really want to help that organization. They feel they've got some land that really would help serve that mission. So they're driven really by a relationship to an entity, to an organization. Some really are focused on the land conservation, and this is a huge group, particularly in the sort of families and individuals world. We deal with folks who have bought the land themselves and owned it for a while and really have become attached in one way or another. We deal with landowners who have had the land in their family for generations and feel a tremendous burden and, in many cases, guilt about not keeping the land in the family. And conservation can offer a tremendous way for them to take care of their legacy, tend to their family legacy, while realizing some income that they may need to do. So this is a great segment of the world to work with, the folks who really care about the land, and that's what's driving them forward. Doesn't mean they don't need some money, but conserving that property is a big part of what's motivating them. It's a balance, and this is actually another big group, right? Yes, I love my town, I like my property, I feel connected to it, I need some income. I've got a kid going to college, I've got a health crisis in the family, I'm headed towards retirement, I don't have as much in the bank as I need. So again, a great opportunity with some of the things we'll be talking about. There are ways to kind of blend conservation giving, and some income for the landowner. So turning to the toolbox, you think it's a great big list of tools that we have. We can acquire land outright, which we often talk about as fee purchase, fee interest in the property, where simply the land trust becomes the owner of the land. Pretty straightforward. The other tool we're going to take apart a little bit is a conservation restriction. This is a way to protect land where the landowner continues to own the property, but it is protected. The uses of the land are limited on into the future. And this includes agricultural preservation restrictions and historic preservation restrictions are sort of a bundle of ways of doing this for different resources. That's our toolbox. We've really got two tools for long-term permanent conservation of property. Now, the good news is we've got 1,000 ways of weaving these together with other opportunities to really make deals work, because if we only had 2 plays to put on in town for our repertory theater, season's over pretty quickly. But really, these are, at the end of the day, these are the ways that we permanently protect land. So land is often talked about as a bundle of sticks, the ownership of land, where each stick in the bundle is sort of a right. The right to cut timber off the property, the right to draw water. There are mineral rights. There's the right to build, to develop the property, the right to go on the property, to access resources, to go through the property for something else. Each of those is a stick in that bundle. All the sticks together are what we talk about as the fee ownership of the land, and basically that includes every legal use of the property. So here in New England, that is how most private lands are held. Most of us own all the sticks in the bundle. We do that subject to regulation, right? The town can say how many houses you can put on a property of X acres, how those houses are sited and how they have to be built. The state has laws and regulations on how timber is harvested, but as the landowner, within that legal regulatory structure, you control each of these. So that's pretty much the fee purchase approach. Now there are properties in Massachusetts. So the mountain in this photo in Chester, Massachusetts, is a property that I worked on acquiring when I was with the Nature Conservancy. The Nature Conservancy owns that mountain subject to mining rights. and the place is riddled with emery mines from 100, 150 years ago. Most emery on your little fingernail emery boards, it's a mineral, it's a nice coarse grit, and most of it now comes from Turkey and that part of the world, but a lot of it used to come out of the hill towns west of the Connecticut River. And so that was one where the mineral rights had somewhere along the way had been separated. That stick had been taken out of the bundle and gone to a mining company that had been absorbed by a mining company. And we could not find who had those mineral rights. I mean, with a massive outlay of funds, we could have had lawyers tearing apart these corporate mergers for ages. But in the end, we decided nobody's mining emery, and these were abandoned because they were no longer feasible, and we decided to take the risk. So occasionally you don't get all the sticks in the bundle, but it's important to know what stick you might be leaving behind and what the risks for your goals for the property are of proceeding that way. So lots of pros and cons to fee acquisition. On the plus side, you own it, you control it as the land trust, you get to determine the fate, you determine how the woods are managed, you determine how soils are managed, if there's agricultural operations. So you have a great deal of control, and you really can determine how that property is cared for over time. On the downside, you have to determine how that property is cared for, and you have to care for it in perpetuity until you find another solution in a partnership arrangement or some other way of addressing those needs. The other downside is it's expensive. It's more expensive to buy the land outright than it is to do a conservation restriction, which we'll talk about in a moment. Gifts of fee are wonderful. They are not all that common, but they do happen. But otherwise, you've got a capital investment that you've really got to figure out, and as well as a stewardship commitment. And generally, when you're taking on property, most organizations these days will not take on the property without understanding how they're going to pay to manage it over time. Setting some money aside as an endowment, generally pooled with money that's going to endow the management of all of that organization's lands. But all of that comes into play when you're thinking about acquiring fee ownership of a property. So back to our bundle of sticks model, thinking now about conservation restrictions. When the land trust buys or acquires a conservation restriction, or when a landowner conveys one, the landowner is conveying out some selected, very carefully defined sticks out of that bundle. The big stick, which we call ownership, stays with the private landowner. But the conservation restriction defines how a whole range of activities can or cannot be used or carried out on the land. So it is not just a contract between the land trust and the landowner. The landowner is actually conveying a partial ownership interest in the land to the land trust. They are permanent, unlike many other sort of neighborly arrangements of deed restrictions and agreements. Those run out over time. Conservation restrictions are permanent. It's very flexible. These are customized documents, which is good news for the landowner and challenging for the land trust, which has to understand what the rules are for every property it has a conservation restriction on and enforce that conservation restriction within those rules. So there is a law in Massachusetts that empowers land trusts and state agencies to acquire conservation restrictions and hold them permanently. And we'll go through some of what makes up a CR in a second. 49 of the 50 states call these conservation easements. Here in Massachusetts, our state law calls them conservation restrictions. So when you're talking to friends in Connecticut, New Hampshire, Maine, wherever, we talk about conservation easements or CEs rather than CRs. These are long documents, 20, 30-page documents. They are often written in legalese, but they don't always really need to be. There are three key areas that I'm going to focus on. There is a lot more that goes into a conservation restriction. But the first thing to really think about with a conservation restriction as a landowner or as a land trust is the purposes, where you really want to lay out in ink on the page why this property is being protected. And you don't want to just say, oh, because there's a rare fish in the brook. Because if that rare fish is no longer in that brook, what's the point of your CR? And you probably aren't doing it just for any one reason. So you really want to look at a whole host of reasons that a property might be valuable and for putting under a conservation restriction. Habitat, is certainly likely to be on that list. Agricultural use is the property in a town open space plan. So, right, so that's saying, well, my town government, my town citizens have said this is an important property to protect. So that's what part of why we're doing the conservation restriction. Is it in any state plans? So again, the purposes are important, well, for several reasons. It's going to help guide the interpretation of that conservation restriction over the coming decades. It's also, should there ever be a disagreement and you end up, the land trust and the landowner end up in mediation or, God forbid, in court, the mediator or the judge is going to be looking at the purposes section to help understand how to settle a dispute, because this is really where we're saying why all the rules are put in place on that property. Then there's a page or so of prohibited uses. Generally, the approach in a conservation restriction, most uses first are prohibited, and then in the next section, all the ones that are important and are going to continue are given back. But just from a legal structure, the cleanest way to create an enforceable CR that provides clarity to the landowner and the land trust is to extinguish a broad range of use and then be clear about what uses are allowed. I was at a workshop recently, and the state group of land trusts in Pennsylvania was talking about their model CR. Their prohibited uses clause is about 2 sentences long, and they say you can't do anything. And then they've got 15 pages of what you can do. That seems like a rather extreme and draconian way to go about it, but interesting nonetheless. So again, pros and cons of conservation restrictions. The big one here is that a landowner doesn't have to give up their land. So if legacy is important for the long-term future, but you're not ready to move off your land, this is a great tool. If you write your CR this way, you can continue to use it pretty much as you have. Continue to manage the timberland, continue to carry out agriculture, continue to do all of the things that have been important to you as a landowner. And you determine that on into the future, that's pretty much the universe of what can happen on that property. So your heirs or the buyers, if you end up selling the land someday, continue to be bound by these rules. So no one can come in and cut down that 40 acres of forest and make it the next subdivision if you have determined for your land that that's not what you want to happen down the road in the future, even long after your ownership has ended. So that's on the partly on the, well, there's more on the plus side. They're less expensive. They are often gifted. So much more so than fee ownership. Conservation restrictions are often the focus of a gift to a land trust. They're very flexible so that the landowner and the land trust can really work together to hammer out what the CR will prohibit and what it will allow. Good news, bad news, right? Because that can make, when there are differing opinions on where that line needs to fall, there's a lot of discussion to have. On the negative side, there are quite time-consuming. They generally take a fair amount of legal input because you're negotiating not just a purchase price like a fee deal and terms of closing and contingencies. You are negotiating the perpetual future use of that property. That's a lot to talk about. So they're a big time investment. And then the stewardship is also challenging. Fee ownership, right? We talked about the importance of planning ahead for how you're going to manage that land, providing for resources to manage the property. Conservation restriction, you've got to steward that CR in perpetuity. That means going there every year or two to make sure that the rules are being followed. And if they're not, you've got to have a difficult conversation, whether that's with the landowner or getting the landowner to have a conversation with their neighbor who might be doing some things across the property line that the conservation restriction prohibits. Deal structure, I'm going to move through a little more quickly, but again, happy to come back to any of this. This is where we start throwing open the barn door. We've got fee purchase and we've got conservation restriction, but now we're bringing other pieces into the mix to build a land conservation deal, and there are a lot of other things that can come into play. Simply on the financing side, a lot of land conservation deals are done at market rate. An appraisal is done, or the property is put on the market for a while, and the seller and the land trust get a sense of the value, and that is the price that ends up being paid for the land. Some are at the other end of the scale, an outright donation. Again, you can donate either a conservation restriction or the land outright. Both of those have positive tax benefits. The IRS recognizes either of those as charitable gifts in certain circumstances. What's much more common than probably either of those is a bargain sale, where the land trust is paying something for the land, but less than its full market value. So if you've got a $100,000 property and the land trust pays $40,000 for that, well, the landowner has had $40,000 of income. They've also made a gift to the land trust of the remaining $60,000 of value. So they get some cash up front to help with life. They get some tax benefits to help down the road, and those can be carried out over many years. And so the bargain sale approach is really where a lot of deals end up. The other is by leaving land or leaving a conservation restriction to a conservation organization through your estate. Bequests are the words, the language that we hear most. When it's land you're leaving to someone, the lawyers in the room are going to call it a devise, but it's the same idea. You can put in your will that you want that land to go to a particular conservation organization. If you do that, I encourage you to call up that conservation organization and let them know it's coming. At the trustees, we actually get quite a number of surprise bequests. Most recently, a property in an area where we are not active. The landowner in his last years put a significant solar field on an 80-some acre property, and we're trying to figure out what the right thing to do here, respecting the owner's wishes, respecting the conservation interest in the property, and frankly, the revenue potential of a property that's generating income every year. So they get interesting. Please call ahead. There are a lot of ways to make the payment. So let's say it's a bargain sale or a market purchase. The land trust may not have all that money in hand, but believes that it can raise it over time. The land seller, the landowner, might be willing and quite happy to take payments year by year for 5 years, 10 years. That stretches out the tax burden on the landowner's side. They may not need all that money all at once, and that can make a deal happen that otherwise wouldn't be fundable on the conservation side. A tool that gets talked about much more than it gets used is this idea of giving land now and retaining the use of it for the rest of my life. Trustees, we do have a small handful of these. What the land trust gets is called a remainder interest. What the landowner keeps is called a life estate. And basically, a deed goes on record, and the deed is conveyed from the landowner to the land trust. And then there's a paragraph that says, however, I retain to myself exclusive use of the property for as long as I live. Generally, there's going to be a side agreement about how the landowner continues to manage that land, keep the house insured and painted if there's a house on the property. So they can be kind of complicated deals in terms of how they play out, though the documentation is pretty straightforward and really works for some folks. And then partnership deals. A minority of land conservation deals these days are done with one land trust and the landowner. There are grants coming into play. Land trusts are teaming up to work with groups of landowners. There's just a lot going on in the world right now because this is what it takes to get these projects done. Land values are high. Some government funding sources are a little lower than they've been in the past. So this is what it takes to get projects done. Again, just a number of ways that land trusts work to get conservation done in their area. Pre-acquisition of properties. State agencies often are less nimble than a local land trust, and even if the state agency wants to acquire a property, they may not be able to move as fast as the landowner feels the deal needs to happen. So land trusts are in a position to acquire the land, hold it until the state agency funding comes around, and then sell it to the state and by and large recoup their investment. Other sorts of assists and partnerships and these large collaborations that I've talked about, again, this is where creativity and imagination comes into what can seem like a fairly nuts and bolts world. This is problem solving. You don't want to start out by creating a 17-player deal. But if it builds to that and that's what's necessary to get the deal done, well, then that's what we do. Because the goal here is to achieve that permanent conservation. Funding sources, nothing too radical here. Always, always, always talk to the landowner about what role they can play in funding the project. Is there a bargain sale to be done here? As a landowner, don't start out, please, thinking I need every penny. There are structures that will help a bargain sale work better for you than you may think. Foundations, there are many foundations funding land conservation these days. Individual donors. Every town has folks who help support local ventures. They are called on a lot. You want to get to know them before you are knocking on their door to help fund a project. But it'd be great to start figuring out who in your project area wants to help get this work done financially. On the public side, local, state, and federal grants and your local land trust, there are lots of resources out there. In Massachusetts, we have the Massachusetts Land Trust Coalition, which is a group of the 140-some land trusts in Massachusetts that has a great website, the Massachusetts Land Trust Coalition, and where a lot of the public funding sources, you can link to information there. Public acquisition programs, right? So something I did long ago working for the state. The state is acquiring land outright and managing it for conservation and public access on into the future. Ballot initiatives, I'm not going to talk too much about, but generally those happen at a statewide level, and many states have instituted a very small sales tax, water tax, all sorts of ways. The Community Preservation Act in Massachusetts is an example of this, where a state law was enacted. Towns can opt in to help fund a pool of money that is available for the town to spend on conservation projects, affordable housing projects, and historical conservation projects. So tax benefits, this gets a little confusing for me fairly quickly, but I'm going to give you an overview, and please, if things aren't clear, speak out. So just to look at sort of the list here. So income tax deduction. There is not a state income tax deduction currently. There was at one time in the past in Massachusetts, but just like any other charitable contribution, a gift of land or a bargain sale, the gift component of a bargain sale, to a qualifying organization can be treated as a charitable contribution. Again, don't assume any specific outcome without talking to a tax advisor. I am not a tax advisor. Even if I knew this inside and out, I could not be a disinterested tax advisor. So the IRS rules continue to provide for significant benefits for gifts of land outright, fee interest, and interestingly, even longer, higher tax benefits for gifts of conservation restrictions, which is due to the influence of the Western legislative delegations, where there's much more interest in driving conservation towards keeping the land in private ownership, even if it's getting protected by conservation restriction. So they have enhanced tax benefits. In Massachusetts, we have an income tax credit, which I'll go over in a little more detail. Hugely beneficial tax structure. If you don't own the land anymore, you don't pay property tax on it anymore. If you put a conservation restriction on your property, it may well reduce the market value and thereby reduce the tax assessment on your property as well. And so your property taxes can go down in the case of a conservation restriction. And then any interest, any value that you convey out, whether that's fee ownership or a conservation restriction, can bring down the value of your estate. At this point, you've need an estate of around $6 million to be subject to federal estate tax. But in Massachusetts, you start paying estate tax at a $1 million estate. And if there's significant land in your estate, that is not as much money as it used to be. So a quick look at the federal tax deduction and then the state tax credit, because the difference between a deduction and a credit is really important to at least understand in a general way. So looking at the federal income tax deduction, the idea here is that the value of your gift, if it qualifies in all the right ways, reduces your income on paper, reduces the amount of income that you pay tax on. So let's say you're earning $80,000, that after your normal usual deductions, that puts you in the 22% bracket. But if you donated land worth $50,000, now instead of paying 22% on $80,000, your taxable income is reduced by that gift of $50,000 worth of land to $30,000, which also drops you into a lower tax bracket. So now you're paying a smaller percent on a smaller number. That's got to sound good. Another nice thing here is if that land you acquired for $8,000, or your father or grandfather did, if you sold it for $50,000, you would also pay a significant tax on that capital gain, right? The increase in value in the land. By giving it, you get to deduct the full $50,000. Nobody pays the tax on the appreciated value of that property. So that's kind of an additional. The same is true of stock gifts. If you get solicitations in the mail from many charities, you'll see that they encourage you to give stock gifts because it is the same kind of structure. Many land conservation organizations accept donations not only of cash and land, but also of stock and other assets for some of these same tax structure reasons. Then the Massachusetts State Land Conservation Credit. Here, instead of reducing the income that you pay tax on, it actually comes straight out of the tax amount that you would otherwise pay. So here, let's say your taxable income is at $80,000, you donate that same property for $50,000. The state program gives you a credit of half the value of your donation, and it caps out at $75,000. So in this case, the tax credit works out to being $25,000. So you calculate your regular tax on the $80,000 of income at the usual Massachusetts rate, which is currently 5.1%. And then you subtract $25,000 from that tax due. Now, most of us are probably not paying $25,000 of Massachusetts state income tax every year. So what happens to all the difference? This is called a refundable tax credit. It's kind of amazing. Let's say your tax that year was $4,080, which is 5.1% of 80,000. Your credit is 25,000. So it wipes out the 4,080. So you pay zero to the Commonwealth, and the Commonwealth sends you a check for the remaining $20,920. So that's what makes it a refundable tax credit. Not surprisingly, this is a highly attractive program for landowners who are interested in conserving their property. The state has put a cap on how much tax credit can go out every year. So that's capped at $2 million currently. We're constantly working with the legislature to try and get that increased. So currently there's about a 2-year wait period to participate in this program to get a tax credit for your gift. Most land trusts are willing to wait it out with you. They'll work with you to get you into the queue, into the line in the program, to help you qualify for the program, to help you provide the documentation for the program. And then you wait it out and you complete your transaction when your turn comes up. So again, and you can do both, right? This is not an either or. If you do a bargain sale transaction of your land, you get the federal income tax deduction, and if you time it all right, you can also participate in the state tax credit program. So this is how you never get all of your value back if you make a land contribution, again, fee interest or CR or bargain sale. But you can recoup a lot of what you're giving comes back to you through the tax benefit structure. And that's all money that the land trust does not have to find to get your deal done. So I guess I'll go very quickly on market value because I want to get to questions soon. But market value is in the eye of the beholder, and yet ultimately there is a value in the marketplace for a given piece of property. Generally, we work with land appraisers to help provide a professional estimate of what that land would actually sell for if you put up a for sale sign, right? So most people, when you put up a for sale sign on your house or on your property, your asking price is not what you expect to get paid for it. What the appraiser is trying to figure out is, what is the world, if you put up the for sale sign and you leave it there for a reasonable period of time, what is the world actually likely to pay you for that property? It's a lot of judgment in there, but there is a lot of data, and then there's a lot of expertise that goes into setting that. So that appraisal is often the basis of a market value transaction for land conservation. A bargain sale, it's kind of different. You don't need to know the actual market value to decide what is going to be paid for the property. So if I've got a farm and what I really need is $128,000 to pay off some debt and to fund my, an annuity for my retirement, the landowner will need an appraisal to file for a tax benefit for the gift portion of their property, but the land trust and the landowner can kind of hammer it out and figure out, okay, that is certainly less than the property's worth, and it works for the landowner, so that deal can go forward as a bargain sale project. Conservation restriction valuation is a little more tricky. Basically, you appraise it twice. So the appraiser figures out what is that land worth as is. If you just put up a for sale sign, you left it there for 30 days, 60 days, what is the world going to pay you for that property? And that's what's called the before value. Then the appraiser poses the situation, say, okay, what if that specific conservation restriction with those specific terms is put on the property and then the for sale sign goes up? What's the world going to pay for that property with those limitations on its use? And then the difference between those two numbers is the value of the conservation restriction, which makes a lot of sense if you think about it. I've got a $500,000 property. I could build a bunch of houses. I've got some nice woodlands that are growing some great timber. So somebody's going to pay me $500,000 for that property. But if I put a CR on it that says, well, you can only do one more house, and yes, you can harvest timber, but you can't exceed certain limits to maintain kind of quality of habitat in the woodland over time, that value of the property is now less. And you've reduced it by a measurable amount, by the uses that you have extinguished, by the value of the things that you can no longer do. And this appraisal approach is designed just to get at that. So as a landowner, you are getting, again, either through tax benefits or an outright payment from the land trust, you are getting value for the things that you're giving up on the land. And it may just be an outright gift, again, of a CR, in which case this is useful for your tax structure, for your tax benefits, but doesn't really inform the deal. So circling back, this is where we started. Hopefully it looks familiar. Hopefully each of these makes a little more sense and you understand the value, or I've completely confused everybody. But at this point, I just want to turn it over to questions, comments, and hear from you on what's interesting, intriguing, what you want to learn more about. Yeah, Steve?
Yeah, I just interested about the CR, the conservation
Yep.
restrictions. Say if you are an operating farmer, and you are, you give up any of your choices of being able to what you grow, or how you use that property?
Yep. Yeah, and I should have gone a little more into an agricultural preservation restriction. So to answer your basic question, do you give up, if you're running a farm operation, you put a restriction on the property, does that constrain how you do your operation and what you can grow? And that is all about how the restriction is written. Mostly they are written quite, well, often they're, for an actual, professional operation, they're written quite broadly because for a farm to remain viable, it's got to be flexible. You can't just stick with what you did last year forever and expect that to work. So the restriction can be written very broadly to, conduct, generally accepted agricultural practices. I wouldn't recommend it be quite that broad because management of animal waste really is a conservation concern and a water quality concern, and their soil practices are of concern. So generally there are some constraints written in for agricultural practices, but it's negotiated as to what it restricts. And it's not going to be so restrictive to say you can grow this crop but not that crop. I've never seen something that's written that way. There are certainly restrictions where they provide for keeping fields open, mowing, haying, but not necessarily row cropping. But if you're talking about an actual operating farm, then you're going to have a broader range of uses written in. So it flashed by on the screen, but there is a difference between a conservation restriction and an agricultural preservation restriction. An APR, the agricultural preservation restriction, is very similar in concept. It permanently limits the activities on the property, and it primarily addresses agricultural issues. But the main entity that acquires those in Massachusetts is the State Department of Agricultural Resources. And their APR has a lot of other stuff written into it, an obligation to continue farming, because their goal is not just to keep the farm going, their goal is to have agricultural soils in agricultural use. They often restrict how the property can be sold, so it has to be sold to another agricultural operator. Whereas a conservation restriction, you can write much of the same agricultural language in the document, but it does not have some of these other elements that an agricultural preservation restriction would have. So just to answer a question you didn't quite ask.
So when it comes to best practices, good practices, obviously, unless it doesn't cross a line with like wastewater or other issues
Right.
with that, it is what some of the standards that are provided are for what is already established that perhaps and recommended by the like UMass Agricultural at that point.
So a lot of things are happening. A lot of APRs or CRs on agricultural lands are being written very diversely. They're happening in very different ways, different places by different organizations. So the state department, has a pretty rigid tool that's online. You can go and check it out and see how they talk about some of these things. Many land trusts, they want to keep it in agricultural use, but they're as interested in water quality and habitat value, and they're as interested in community character. We have trustees owns a property that is subject to a CR held by the town. Enforced by the local land trust under contract with the town. And we wanted to put up a hoop house. I mean, this is a row crop farm. We're running a community-supported agriculture operation on it with 150 members. It's a producing farm. And it was quite a long process to reach agreement that the restriction did not prohibit a hoop house that would extend the growing season and increase the productivity of that farm. And that's largely because the document had a lot of scenic provisions in it. It had a lot of limits on structures outside of a limited building area. All of these documents often have zones with different levels of restriction. So, on a residential property, you might carve out 1.5 acres out of 40 acres and call that the building envelope, where you can, mow and plant grass and do all kinds of things that are normal in a homestead area. But once you get beyond that 1.5 acres, no destroying vegetation except under a plan for habitat improvement. So there are zones, and that's true of agricultural properties for sure, where the agricultural buildings are restricted to an area of the property.
So the importance of a diversified farm. It's very important for you to maintain to write this as a flexible, try to get as flexible as possible.
Well, balancing your other interests, right? It's flexibility without impinging on other values that you have, like water quality. And that is the trick. A lot of agricultural restrictions out there talk about, agriculture subject to an NRCS farm plan, which is a national farm soils program. Well, they don't do farm plans anymore. So now we've got to figure out what other sort of best management practice, external, source of the best management practice do we look to for some of those. But a lot of that is looking out to the world for best management practices, so that helps everyone feel comfortable that we're not sort of creating an oddball restriction here. All right, yeah, Margaret.
The photographs behind the information are just beautiful. Are most of those trustees' properties and mostly in Massachusetts, or where were all those images?
Yeah, I think everything, yes, everything, I don't think I had anything outside of Massachusetts, and the vast majority are trustees' properties. We have a treasure trove of excellent photos of our properties. So I think the only one I took was the one that I showed with the mountain full of emery holes. And actually, the property in the foreground of that photo, we put under a conservation restriction. So that had both fee ownership in the distance and conservation restriction on that small sort of hobby farm, hobby sheep farm. Yeah. Okay, great. Well, thank you very much.